I believe that this is one of the most misunderstood concepts in the Bible when it comes to being a wife. And today I'm going to teach you what it is and how you can apply it in your life right now to help you prepare to be a good wife. So what is it? It is the topic of submission versus subjection, and that they are not the same thing. You can almost feel the tension in the room whenever a pastor goes to this passage of Ephesians 5 where it says, "And wives, submit yourself to your husbands as unto the Lord." And if God didn't say that women were to be silent in church and to learn in silence and to ask their husbands at home, I always feel like I should raise my hand and say, it's not that big a deal. It's not as awful as women perceive it to be, and it's because they don't understand this thing. And if you haven't watched the video on the first thing that you should be learning to be a good wife, I will link that. But when it comes to submission, I grew up in upstate New York, and if there is a state that teaches women to take the lead and take charge, and that men are unnecessary and women can do everything that a man can do, New York is that state. And I would have to say that I was a little bit of a feminist growing up. I am an independent, educated, visionary, driven woman. None of that is wrong. But I use it within the bounds of God's role for my life. But having grown up in New York, the issue of submission was something that I just kind of butted up against. And when I went to Bible college, I met a lady who was the best friend of her husband. And I took note of that because it was so different than what the entire culture that I grew up in, so different than that. And she said, ladies, submission is a spirit. Subjection is obedience, but submission is a spirit. It's a, sure, why not? It's yielding to the will of somebody else. And I was trying to teach this to my daughter the other day, and she was washing dishes, and she was frustrated, and she said, well, Mom, it's a lot easier to wash the dishes when I want to wash them than when somebody else tells me to. And I said, exactly, because your spirit is resistant to it. It's not the washing of the dishes. I said, you need to learn submission, obedience with a happy heart. And she said, well, I am obeying. Isn't that good enough? And I said, no, it's not good enough, because submission is the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down. And when I look at the Bible, I think about Zipporah and Moses. It's a classic example of a woman who is in obedience to her husband but has no submission at all. Her spirit has not yielded in that sweet and meek and quiet spirit of trusting the Lord with the outcome. If you're not familiar with the story of Moses, he was a Jew. And while the Jews were being slaughtered by Pharaoh in Egypt, he was rescued and raised in the home of Pharaoh. And the Bible is true. You can go look at that historically and find that Moses was the adopted son of Pharaoh. But as he was older, he was seeing the persecution of his people, and he ended up murdering somebody and had to flee away. And when he fled, he met Jethro and Zipporah, and he married Zipporah in a foreign land. She was not familiar with the God of the Jews. She wasn't familiar with the culture of the Jews. And when God asked Moses to come back to help his people depart from the land of Egypt, one of the things that they had to do was to circumcise their children. It was part of the covenant with Abraham, that the Jews were a separated people. And so this was a surgery on their sons, and they had not done it. Well, as Moses was going to obey the Lord to go to the Israelites, there was an angel at the door that was going to kill them. And as you read it in the Bible, it was as if they knew the reason why. And they had had this conversation previously But Zipporah drew a line in the sand and was like, not gonna do it. We're not gonna have this surgery on my sons. And then when push came to shove, she grabbed the sharp stone, she did the surgery, threw the thing down, but she was just like, God's a bloody God and a bloody religion, and she was so angry. But she had obeyed. And that spirit of contention, I believe, followed them through the wilderness. I don't think she ever truly submitted to God and had that spirit of, sure, why not? I trust that God will take care of us. Because the contention got so thick between Moses and Zipporah that Moses sent her back to Jethro because she was so contentious in the marriage. I put the responsibility on her because I look at who Moses is as a person. He was not antagonistic. He was not nitpicky. He was one of the most meek, merciful, long-suffering leaders in all of the Bible. But his wife was contentious. And even though she was following him along as God led him, in her heart, she had no submission, no yielding, no trusting. It was a fight every step of the way. In the end of the story, Jethro saw the work of God and how the God of Moses was the true God. He'd seen all of the miracle and the plagues and how God had provided for the Israelites in the wilderness. And Jethro came and he brought Zipporah back with him. And in my heart, I hope she changed. But we have another example of a wife in the Bible. And Sarah, God praises Sarah as somebody who trusted in God and obeyed her husband. But Sarah was a woman who ebbed and flowed, and she grew in her relationship with the Lord. Early on, we see that when God said, I will grant you a son, she laughed. And then he said, did you laugh? And she was like, no, I didn't laugh. And then, as is with women, we tend to figure things out and try to plan and make things work because we're impatient, and we do sometimes lack a trust in the Lord. And so she said, you know what, I figured out a plan. What God really meant was this. And so she offered Hagar, and we know the story of how that backfired, and she became bitter, and she put pressure on Abraham to cast out this poor woman that Sarah had put in that situation. But she grew in her faith and her trust, and she saw God keep his promise. And then when it came to Abraham taking her son, her only son, as a sacrifice, she kept silent. I believe she trusted God, and she yielded to the will of God with a sweet and meek and quiet spirit, something we can only attain as we submit ourselves to the Lord and resist the devil. But then you look at the story of the two brothers in the parable that Jesus gave, and the father had asked them both to do a job, and one said, oh sure, no problem, I'll get right to that, and never did it. And the other said, no, I don't want to do that. But later on he repented and he came back and he obeyed. But that repentance and that obedience came with the spirit of submission, whereas the first one had a spirit of submission and didn't obey. And so it is a package deal. The right heart is just as important as obedience. But God says, commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established. Sometimes we just have to do what's right, even if we aren't feeling that way, and pray and trust God to help us to get our heart yielded and submitted to him. What I say is sometimes it's hard to trust your husband, or it's hard to trust those in authority. And you might struggle submitting and saying, sure, why not, to them. But if you can submit yourself to the Lord and say, God set it up this way, I will trust him. I will submit to him. I'll say, sure, why not? It's not a big deal. It's not being a doormat. A doormat is somebody who so fears the rejection of others or the lack of pleasing them, or what they will say or do, that a weakness within you, a lack of security within you, causes you to just back off and say, okay. Submission is a matter of strength of mind and saying, my number one goal is to please God. God is just asking you to submit yourselves to your authority and to submit yourselves one to another in love, esteeming others better than yourselves. But if you're struggling with this one issue, again, I would encourage you to watch the first video, because that teaches you the strength and how to get your heart in that place. Have a great day.